Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello, and thank you for joining us here on From the Vault. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian at the South Carolina Historical Society. I am thrilled to bring you today's episode because I had the chance to sit down and chat with author and professor Peter H. Wood. He has been teaching students for decades, first at Duke University and now at the University of Colorado-Boulder. He's also authored and co-authored many books and academic articles, including the seminal 1974 book, Black Majority, Negroes in Colonial South Carolina from 1670 through the Stono Rebellion, which is the book that we're talking about today. But before we get into that, let's hear some announcements. Our winter lecture series has begun and continues every Tuesday through March 4th, featuring lectures on the untold stories of the American Revolution. All lectures will be held at the Unitarian Church in downtown Charleston, or they can be streamed online. And we are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's triumphant American tour on Friday, March 14th. We're holding an event at the Fireproof Building in Charleston featuring a piano made specially for Lafayette's tour. And 2 pianists will play period-specific music throughout the event, with drinks and light snacks available as well. Find out more about both of these events, the Winter Lecture Series and our Lafayette event, and get your tickets on the news and events page of our website, schistory.org. In 2024, Dr. Wood released a 50th anniversary edition of his book Black Majority with a tweaked subtitle, Race, Rice, and Rebellion in South Carolina, 1670 to 1740, along with a new introduction, epilogue, and some other changes to update it for the 21st century. The book studies Black people during the colonial period of America, a time that was often neglected in the study of those who were enslaved, and it brought forward new ways of looking at the available resources. It challenged the idea that those enslaved were passive and unskilled laborers, showing evidence of their agency over themselves and how their skills, culture, and customs were vital to forwarding the economic success of our nation. The book was a National Book Award finalist in 1975 in the category of history, and Wood has received the American Historical Association's Asher Distinguished Teaching Award. All right, let's get into our interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Wood, for joining us here on the podcast. It's wonderful to have you.
My treat. Thank you.
So, of course, we're going to be talking a lot about your book, Black Majority, during this interview. Okay. And I kind of want to start at the beginning of when you were writing it. The book started as your dissertation.
It was.
When you're getting your PhD at Harvard, and you're originally from St. Louis.
Right.
So how did you come to the idea of this topic from someone who had no prior connection to South Carolina?
I was a grad student at Harvard in the late 60s, knowing that I wanted to study early American history, colonial history. But I was also a child of the civil rights movement, so to speak, watching it from the distance. And the moment, I suppose, if I narrowed it down, would be the Detroit riots of 1967. I was taking a summer school German language course and watching what was unfolding in Detroit on a little black and white Sony TV. And what struck me most was that the announcers for CBS, Roger Mudd, was a young reporter flying around in a helicopter, and he was covering Detroit the way he had covered Vietnam, like go up in a helicopter and say, oh, I don't know why they're all killing each other. And that was what he was saying in Detroit. And I thought, wait a minute, he's supposed to be explaining this to us. He doesn't know where these people came from or what they're upset about or anything. And the next morning, I literally went into Harvard's big Widener library and started looking through the shelves to see where there were discussions, sort of colony by colony, of Black history. And there was a little bit in Massachusetts and Connecticut and even in Virginia, a couple of articles. And I got to South Carolina and it was blank. It was literally blank, and I remember pulling out a book that said, you can't write about the history of South Carolina unless you have been born under a magnolia tree and seen the mockingbirds. It was that. It was just this, don't come ask us any questions. And of course, that's kind of a challenge if you're in graduate school. And it's also a gift if you're trying to study early American history, and there's only 13 colonies, and you realize that one of them has never been studied in full, and that your professors in New England don't know anything about it. They in those days, if you were an Ivy League professor, you would write one article about Virginia to show that you understood the South, and you'd talk about Thomas Jefferson and tobacco, and then you were free to go back to write about the Puritans. and so South Carolina was really off the map. And I said, I want to go down there and see what I can find. And they didn't say, no, you can't go. That was the best they could do. But they said, that's fine, but I don't think you're going to find anything. And that was the cliche in those days, was that nice try, but there are no records, you won't find it. So that got me started. And so I came right here to Charleston during the tricentennial in 1970.
Well, I have a question about the South Carolinians' pride about their history in just a minute, but before we get to that part, and
white Carolinians have pride.
And what I mean by pride is don't bother telling our story.
yeah, only us.
Yes, but I have a question about that in just a minute. But before we get to that, and before we talk about kind of the updated version of Black Majority for its 50th anniversary, talking more about the original book, you spent a lot of time in Columbia and in Charleston, as you mentioned, and the Department of Archives and History in Columbia and the South Caroliniana, and of course at the South Carolina Historical Society here in Charleston too. What was the research process like for that? And what were you able to find? Because as you mentioned, the prevailing idea at the time was there's nothing there. Don't bother.
Well, one story comes to mind that's a little hard to imagine in modern day Charleston with big cruise ships coming through and money flowing around pretty easily. I mean, it's a thriving town, whatever its problems are. Mm-hmm. And 50 years ago, not so much. I got a good look at genteel poverty, and the fireproof building was being restored. So all the records were over in a warehouse on East Bay Street.
Wow, yeah.
And I would go in there to study. And I remember looking at the Pringle record book. Pringle was one of the people who had purchased slaves. And it was a big ledger. And each time I turned a page, it would almost fall apart. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was being very careful. But, and I said to the librarian, Ms. Pryor, Ms. Pryor, I said, I'm the last person who's ever going to look at this. It's not going to be anything left if we don't fix this. Mm-hmm. And I was used to these rich northern schools where everything was in order and everything had been in those days you would laminate those pages that were falling apart. And I said, how much would it cost to laminate this thing? And she said, I don't know, $90 or something. And I wrote him a check. I mean, I had a graduate scholarship, and
Yeah.
I was, so I wasn't rich, but
Wow.
but for that little, it was like, look, we got to save this thing,
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was that element to it. And then there were other kinds of resistance that were stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Lee, the director of the archives in those days, who was quite prominent, and was the head of the National Archives Association and stuff, he took me out to lunch after about 6 months because they were always surprised that I came back the next Monday morning. They would say, are you still here? And I was there working away, and he took me out to lunch, and he said, would you like to see the records for the slave revolt of, I don't know what he said, 1795 or something like that. I said, I didn't know there was a slave revolt. And he said, well, we don't tell many people about that. And that was where I got a sense of, the history's handled differently in South Carolina. In New England, you do research. It's more like science. It's not, there are plenty of prejudices involved, but if you can come up with the evidence, then people will say, oh, okay, we need to change our textbook or something. South Carolina, especially in those days, it was more like a religion. This is what we believe and we're sticking to it.
Yes. Well, that kind of speaks to the question that I was mentioning, because one of the questions that I had was, were the people here surprised by what you found, or did they know and they just didn't tell anybody, or didn't think it was important enough to tell anybody, or both?
They really didn't know, because the cover-up had been so successful for so long, so that most white folks just did not know. And most African Americans not so much. I mean, didn't. And when I came, as I said, it was the tricentennial, and in Columbia, one of the grad students was working behind the desk at the archives, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know they had slaves in those days," and I was so surprised by that I put it in my introduction. I said, there was actually somebody who didn't even know. And 3 years later, I came here to Charleston to give a talk, and they sent somebody to the airport to pick me up. A grad student came and met me at the airport, and he said, hello, Dr. Wood. I know there were slaves in those days. He was afraid he would appear in my next introduction, but it was that, these were history grad students who were scratching their heads, and so it was definitely a dark hole. It was not something that had been touched much.
So I know that you've worked with the material in your Black Majority book several times over the years since it was originally published, including in classes that you've taught and that sort of thing. But for this 50th anniversary edition, what was it like for you revisiting that material with an eye for adapting it slightly, tweaking it for a new audience, especially some of the language changes that you did in the book?
First of all, it was reassuring, because it wasn't, sometimes after 50 years, I suppose you have to say, oh my God, take out chapter 3, it's wrong, and turn it upside down or whatever. And I'll stand by everything that's in it. There's obviously been lots of good scholarship since then, but I didn't feel it was my job to try to plug in 50 years of scholarship. This is what we knew in the 70s. And so, but I did want to change the language. And I took Negro out of the subtitle and out of the text. But I also took Stono Rebellion out of the title, because when I wrote it 50 years ago, no one had ever heard of the Stono Rebellion. And I put it in the subtitle specifically so that even if you didn't read the book, you would, you would see Stono. What's that all about? And now there is more awareness, not enough as far as I'm concerned, but there is more awareness of Stono and the events surrounding that. But the other thing I wanted to change was that it was written originally as a dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
So there were lots of footnotes, and those got put to the back this time. And that's just the way publishing is these days. I kind of like having them at the bottom of the page so you could look at them
easily
and see.
find them.
Yeah,
Quickly.
because in those days you wanted the evidence right there in front of the reader so they couldn't say, oh, this guy's just making this stuff up. I wanted them to look and say, where did he find that? And then see that, oh, if you don't believe me, I can give you 4 more citations.
Yes.
So it's footnotes to the back of the book. But also, as a dissertation, it had some long sentences and long paragraphs. And to try to reach a broader readership, I wanted to cut some paragraphs in half and cut some sentences in half and try to move the reader along a little more quickly. And also, frankly, toughen it up a little bit in the sense that I think we're still not ready and able to understand the scope and duration and sickness that was human slavery. But we are closer. I won't say whether it's 17% or 23,
right.
and we're still a long way off. But so, for instance, I sometimes use the phrase now slave labor camps instead of plantations. And I'm not a member of the word police. I don't think, but I do think it's fine to change meanings if they help you get, obviously replacing slave with enslaved sometimes has a good effect because it makes you think, oh, this person wasn't born a slave. They're not intrinsically a slave. They were forced to be enslaved, and they're trying to get out of that silly status. And so that was a change. But mostly, as I say, the substance of the book is still right there. And the great paradox is that it's very well understood and absorbed now within the academic community. But I can go in front of a public audience anywhere, anytime, and say which of the 13 colonies was more than half Black at the time of the American Revolution. And they think it's a trick question. They go, oh, is that New Jersey maybe or New Hampshire? So all Americans have a kind of mythological view of the past, whether it's wagon wheels moving west or whatever, but particularly the 18th century and the foundation, we tend to, what was taught in schools way back in the previous century when I was going to school, you learned about the Mayflower and you learned about Jamestown and you learned about Thomas Jefferson and you learned they grew tobacco in Virginia and that was about it. And then you had the Revolution. And this whole book stops 30 years before the Revolution. And so I can also stump people asking them, well, what was the richest colony of the 13? Again, got to say New York. They don't know. No, it was South Carolina. And why was it rich? What were they growing? Oh, let me see. It must have been cotton or sugar or probably tobacco. That's what Thomas Jefferson grew. And no knowledge of rice. And yet, this book is 50 years old. And that was the main thesis was that they were growing rice, getting rich off rice, and it was Africans who understood rice. And just today, I was upstairs in the Addlestone Library looking at a handsome new exhibition on slavery and rice and Sierra Leone and all that stuff. And the exhibit says that the first book about it was in 1995.
Oh my
so
goodness!
Nothing about Black majority, nothing about Dan Littlefield's research. Too bad.
Wow. Your chapter on the Gullah language was fascinating to me. Because while I know some about Gullah, just sort of the origins and everything that you talked about, I was like, I should have learned this in school.
Well,
we should have talked about that.
I wish I'd been there to talk to you because you're saying that brings back a recollection for me because when the book came out, the first invitation I had to speak about it was from Beaufort. And I spoke in one of the churches there. And I remember, wondering how this is going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the entire first pews were occupied by little old ladies with white hair. And their questions were like, now, who are you kin to, Dr. Wood? And that kind of thing. And then they filibustered for, when it came to Q&A, they basically filibustered for the 20 minutes we had or whatever, and just like, let's not go there, or, and obviously that has changed somewhat, and there are people in your category who are the children of that who are ready to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I've recently, because Jimmy Carter, one of my heroes, just passed away, and I've been rereading his memoir about his childhood in Plains, growing up in the 20s and 30s, and he gives a wonderful description of his parents and grandparents and their view of the lost cause and stuff. And you can see him, obviously, he figured it out a lot faster and better than most white Southerners, but it's a process, and you could see him realize, his granddaddies were diehards, and lost causers, and then his mother is a nurse and has a different, more humanistic view, and all his best playmates in Plains were black kids, that they were. And they would go to the movies together, and the black kid, JJ, would sit up in the balcony and he would sit down below. And he said that's just the way it was. Mm-hmm. But unlike lots of Southerners, he was able to process that faster and better. So it's been slow.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something in the introduction of the book, and I've heard you talk about it. I've read about you talking about it in interviews, but it was something that I was struck by. You discussed the abundance of records available about those who were enslaved in some sources, but that there were a lack of index entries for those records because they weren't considered important enough to include in the index. So how do you think that secondary sources and writing about those who were enslaved has changed in the last 50 years, or has it?
No question, it's changed, and you wouldn't get books like that now where it was in the text, all over the text, but was not indexed, because they were being treated as property like cows and horses, and you weren't indexing every cow and every horse, and that was the way it was passed down in that sort of lost cause historiography. Obviously, things have changed, but I'm working on a book now called The Blackout, which is about forbidding African Americans to read and write for 200 years. And you say, wow, when I say that, because you hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Because what we talk about when we talk about slavery, most of the books, even the big, newest, best accepted books, talk about the physical violence. There was not enough to eat. The housing was terrible. There were physical punishments. There was rape and abuse and all those physical dilemmas. But the mental abuse, so to speak, of not being allowed to read and write in a culture that is becoming increasingly more dependent on print. This is the Ben Franklin world, where, and by the time of the Revolution, American colonies have more newspapers per person than England does. But in places like South Carolina, it's off limits for the majority of the population. And the Negro Law, as it was called, that was passed right after the Stono Rebellion, like we've got to really put the lid on this thing. That was the first law that said you're not allowed to teach enslaved people how to write. Didn't even mention reading. It just said writing, because if you know how to write, you could write a pass that says, it's okay for you to go to Charleston or whatever else. Or you could write a note to another conspirator, or you could do something or other. And then after that, Georgia falls into line, and Virginia and all the other southern colonies really clamp down. And it's not as though there was lots of education going on before that. There wasn't.
Right.
Yeah, everybody was working too hard. And most of the white folks were illiterate too. I mean, there's not a high, especially in the South, there was not a high literacy rate. Whereas in the North, and we forget this sometimes, we know that the Puritans settled New England and so on, but the reason they were Puritans was they were radical Protestants. They were being kicked out of England for being too Protestant. And their essence of their Protestantism was everybody needs to read the Bible. You don't want some Catholic bishop standing up there talking Latin to you. You want to read the scripture yourself, and that's always still to this day is that the essence of serious Protestantism is to know the gospel, backwards and forwards, and so that was a big difference,
When we talked about a little bit about this earlier, but you also write in the book about the perception or lack thereof of South Carolina's importance in American history and African American history. And at the time, the emphasis was placed on the North, and Virginia represented the South as a whole. So how much of that do you think has changed since you first wrote this book?
I don't think very much, actually. I'm not the person to ask because I've always been very focused on South Carolina and very enamored of the place and shocked by much of its thinking and doing. And I'm struck elsewhere in the country at how little people still understand South Carolina. And by understand, I don't mean getting off a tourist ship and buying a mint julep in Charleston or something. I mean really realizing that if I say Boston to you or Philadelphia, you immediately maybe think the 18th century and drum fifes and drums,
the beginning of the country.
Yeah, this is what it's all about. That's how we were formed. That's where we come from. Even if I'm an immigrant who arrived 20 years ago, that's what I'm supposed to learn. And in my world, we would learn about Charleston Harbor. We would learn that this is part of our history. And it's not a pretty part, but it's also let me put it this way. I've often felt that while enslavement was at its worst in early South Carolina, if South Carolina could turn the corner in the way that we were talking earlier about Jimmy Carter turning the corner, imagine, let's just be specific, if the evangelical church had all become Jimmy Carters of the world, and we would be in a very different place. And South Carolina would have led us there. The Quakers in Philadelphia tried to lead us to a more humane culture, and they didn't succeed either, but they tried, and their story should be lifted up, and so I don't think we've gotten there yet, and we'll see. We'll see.
You used several, as we mentioned, archival institutions for your research. So as a user of archives, what role do you think that they have played or they could play in the future in connecting the public with this history that they might not learn in school, that they might have to go seek out elsewhere?
Oh, well, you're talking to somebody who wrote a book using 3x5 file cards, and a typewriter, so, obviously things have changed so much, not only intellectually in the way we've been describing, but also technologically, and the process. I mean, I had to come to Columbia, come to Charleston, leave when they closed at 9 o'clock at night. I couldn't sit at home and 24/7 and call up documents and research old books and do the amazing thing. But I'm often struck when I think about that, or when I see young people being so dexterous at finding things. You would think that history would have gotten a big boost out of this. You would think that our books would be so much better and so much more authoritative and well documented. So not so much. Most of the books we're getting now on African American history are basically memoirs, of people saying, "Oh yes, this is my family's story," or this, and that's fine, but it's often. And this is a big problem for me. And one of the reasons Black majority, I think, still sits on the sidelines in certain ways is that more and more we tend to do history backwards. We work back from the present and say, "Oh, yes, I know about the civil rights movement and Jim Crow. Yeah. Oh, and Reconstruction. I read a book. I mean, we're having a renaissance of Reconstruction books now. Okay. And then before that, there was the Civil War, and then there was slavery before that. And I'm not sure how long it lasted or when it started or what, and I don't think that perception has changed very much, certainly not for the general public. You say slavery to them and they think cotton fields in antebellum Mississippi. They don't know rice was being grown, and they don't know there are people now, I'm not one of them, but I bless their hearts, using the best new technologies, LIDAR, which is one of these radar penetrating ways that you can use a drone to survey. And you can look right through a forest and see that, oh, that used to be a rice field, because you can see the ditches even through the trees. And they're now finding that there were twice as many rice fields as we thought. Even in South Carolinians didn't know how many there were. And they're starting to calculate, if you put these ditches end to end, et cetera, and it's like digging ditches from here to Seattle and back a couple of times.
Wow.
I mean, it's unimaginable how much work was put in. And I sometimes compare it to building their pyramids of Egypt, because it's something you can see from outer space. You can look down on the South Carolina coast. If you fly into Charleston, you can look down for 10 minutes and still see those remains. But if you drive along the highway, you don't see them very well. So you can drive along the highway and not even know that used to be a rice field.
And that's seeing the knowledge and the skill that those who were enslaved had and brought with them in some cases from Africa to know how to do all of that stuff.
Right.
Which
and you were asking about change, and that's something that has changed a little bit. I think it's not in the mid 20th century, that was still considered inconceivable. I mean, Africa was, in the popular imagination, was Tarzan, and it was the dark continent, and the idea that people there could know how to do things that people in South Carolina had to ask them how to do it, that was just too much to take. That's changed some, but not very well, not fully.
Well, and in speaking of that, I think the last question I have is, how do you hope that the next 50 years will evolve the study of the contributions of those who were enslaved, their contributions to our collective history as a state, but also as a nation?
It's a tough question, and I don't want to be too pessimistic. And so on my good days, I feel that there are things going on around us that remind me of the 1960s, when this book and Ted Rosengarten's book about All God's Dangers and lots of exciting new scholarship by younger people was being done. And the similarity that I'm hoping for is that we were responding to how bad things were. The cliche then was the generation gap and don't trust people over 30 and that kind of stuff. But that's because the Vietnam War was going on. It was so clear that the elders had really messed things up badly, and that had to do with watching police dogs in Birmingham. And it's like, wait a minute, if this is what the grownups are doing, if they still think that's okay, it's not okay with my generation. That's not what we're going to beat them at their own game. If they want to write history, we'll write history, and I think we're at another moment like that where things are so, let's just say, confused. Screwed up would be another term. There are other phrases one could use, but it's not a secret anymore.
Right.
There are big problems, and they're coming at us faster than we can handle them. And there's a backlog, as there was in the 60s. There was a backlog of, we should have fixed this in the 30s or in the 1880s or what, we should have fixed this, and we haven't. And so I think there's certainly room for a younger generation, with or without their electronics and their cell phones, to say, okay, I've had enough. The fact that we've just within the last month watched all these terrible fires in California and experienced terrible floods in North Carolina, and it's not a surprise, right? It's like, we were telling you that. And some of that was going on. If you think about it, most of the issues that concern us now were front and center when Jimmy Carter was president. What are we going to do about the environment? What are we going to do about human rights? What are we going to do about race relations? Those were things that one generation was ready to try to deal with, and we kicked the can down the road, and here we are. So I think it's up to the under 30s to say, okay, it's our lives that are at stake and our culture that's at stake, and we're not going to see it go down the drain. We'll see. We'll see.
Well, I think that's all I had, unless there was anything else that you wanted to add.
I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
Yeah, but I appreciate it.
Well,
it's a treat.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was really wonderful. And thank you for joining us on the podcast. We'll see you back here on the second Monday in March for our next episode.